long version for our dear listeners is that I grew up with a really horrible example of what it means to be a man that was based around physical violence and domination. My dad was a special forces veteran in the South African border wars for a unit that earned the nickname the Murder Battalion, because of the things that they did in Southern Africa in the 80s and 90s. And so what that meant for me as growing up as a child, as a sensitive boy, is that I was brutally shamed for having any sense of emotion and for experiencing the world in a human way. And I was given a model of masculinity to aspire to that really was harmful in so many ways. And when my dad, emotionally, physically, and verbally abused my mom, my sister, and I, it wasn't something that we even identified as abuse until much later in life, because it was such a powerful, kind of normalized experience. And so I grew up trying to be a lot like my dad in as many ways as I could. But I also grew up with these like natural tendencies towards sensitivity and just being like empathetic and human. And so I was constantly ostracized by a lot of other boys. And when I started school, because I wasn't like naturally athletic or didn't have a natural predisposition to some of the American sports like football, baseball, and soccer. So from kind of all angles in my life personally growing up, whether it was in my home from my father or at school from other boys, kind of in society, I was fed, I was bullied and put down, and then fed messaging that there must be something wrong with me because of the way that I express my version of boyhood and manhood. Which really deeply affected me, because growing up thinking like, man, there's something defective. Like the formula is wrong. It was supposed to be sugar, spice, and everything nice, and whatever else it goes into the cauldron. And then
Yeah.
somehow I something's wrong. And then I got into university and I started taking some gender studies classes, and I took some courses in sexual violence prevention. And I started working at a domestic violence center when I was 21. And I just naturally gravitated towards these fields, like without ever identifying that I was a survivor of domestic violence. And I had recently cut my dad out of my life at this point. And all of a sudden it hit me like an epiphany, like my whole world. I was like, oh my goodness, this is my experience. And also in these gender studies classes where I learned what is the patriarchy, what is this value system that our entire society is indoctrinated into, and how does that contextualize my own experience? How does that take away the power of, personally, there's something wrong with me, and rather to say, oh no, there's like so many men out there struggle with these questions of like, what does it mean to be a man, and what do I need to do in order to show up as a man in the world? So a few years later, in my earlier 20s, I decided, hey, I'm feeling this incredible lack of support from men, even though I had tried all these things. Like I played rugby in college. I played rugby for a bit after college. I'd ride motorcycles. I started going to the gym. I got pretty fit and athletic. Like I was doing all of the traditional inputs, and yet I still felt a very severe emotional lack. I wasn't being supported by other men. And so I led this men's retreat out of just on a whim. I was like, I think we need to get a bunch of men together to speak about what's going on in our lives, because you don't have to have had an abusive father to still question and like experience some emotional disconnection from the world. And it went really amazing, and that's how Hey Brother Co was born. And here I
That's
am a few
awesome.
years later.
Yeah, that's so cool. I mean, obviously,
Yeah.
the whole experience is such a it's a unique thing you've gone through. Obviously, a really horrible thing to have to deal with abuse growing up. But I think one of the things that fascinates me about yourself is that you were really able to kind of like stare into the abyss with it a little bit, and you've turned this around into something so positive. To go from, growing up with abuse in the home, having your idea of masculinity set through that, and then being presented with people going through it now, and you're in this role of support and help, and they're dealing with violence, they're dealing with abuse, and you're seeing it. I guess it becomes almost impossible to not reflect on your own view of manhood, especially going through gender studies, having that academic approach to it. It would be impossible for it not to start those questions. And I think what, to me, is, I mean, the whole thing, the fact that you've kind of come through just as a healthy, well-adjusted human is obviously impressive. But the fact that you've taken that and you've gone, well, do you know what? Other people probably feel a bit like me, even if their reason to feel like that is different. And that's fascinating. Are you able to talk to us about what it was to actually look at that and then create a positive change out of it. Because I think for so many young guys, and we'll get into why we think this way and this and that, it's really hard to actually ever just separate yourself from your idea of what masculinity is. What allowed you to
Uh,
do that in such an intense way and actually succeed?
Hmm. This is such an excellent question. You are a phenomenal interviewer. I love it. We're like bantering,
Thank you.
chatting before the show starts, and then the recording button hits, and you lock in, and you become, I don't know, like an amazing. Like I just, um, what a good question. I think it was one of the hardest things that I've ever had to do, and it's been a lifelong and ongoing process. Where I am today, I'm very proud of, and I'm very grateful for. I love the man that I am today, and I'm consistently, continuing to learn and grow and evolve. But it wasn't like I snapped my fingers and then all of a sudden, hey, I no longer care when the world calls me names or anything. Like it took consistent work and effort, therapy, a lot of different inputs. But what was a huge motivating factor was actually my relationship with my mom and my sister, because the way that my dad began to treat me when I went away to university and we no longer had regular contact, and this is before I cut him out of my life, but I mean, I didn't live with him anymore. I noticed that there was this big distinction in how he treated me once I got taller, once I started to play sports and get more athletic and look more like a man. He started to treat me better. And one of the ways that he would try to relate with me is to make disparaging remarks and comments about my mom and my sister. And I've found that that is in some ways a lot of the ways that men try to relate with one another is, hey, like even if we don't have any common interests or common hobbies or common values, we can fall back on the fact that at least we're not women. And so we can talk about women's bodies or talk about women's appearances or, femininity as this bad thing. And just like banter, locker room talk is a nice backdrop for men to relate to one another. And it made me really uncomfortable on the one hand to have my father say these things about my mom and my sister, about their weight, about their appearance, about, their character. But on the other hand, he was showing me more attention than he'd ever shown me before and more approval. I felt like I was getting an insider view now at what I've always wanted. So it really felt like this like crossroads of what do I choose? Because some of the major fights that I had with him at this time were me asking him to speak more kindly, say, "Hey, don't talk about mom and Emily like that." And I think that it finally just something clicked in me where I realized like my mom and my sister have been there for me for my entire life, have treated me with love and respect and kindness and compassion in ways that my dad never has. And so I kind of do have to make this choice almost about like who I want to keep in my life. And even though there was this really emotional, visceral pull to stay to have a father basically
Yeah.
because of the father wound is so present, I knew that I was making this right choice. So that's kind of what spurred it in my early 20s. But if like I mean it's one of the hardest things that I've had to do, not just in terms of choosing to cut my dad out and like choosing my mom and my sister, but everything I thought to be true, like all of these inputs in the world, like if I can just get big enough and strong enough, if I play rugby, if I can prove people that I'm tough, if I can yeah, be like attractive enough, if I can be whatever enough, then I'll finally be worthy, right? Like you have to flip that entire model on its head. Like everything I was raised to believe for the first 2 decades of my life, and I had to decide like what am I going to do now? And it's really really difficult to do that. And I yeah can get into specifics, but it's like it's such a challenging thing. So for any men or young men that are listening, it is not easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen instantaneously. It's a lifelong process of deciding what have I been taught about manhood from a little age. Like if I was told don't throw like a girl or boys don't cry when I was 3 years old, 4 years old, how did that affect me? And how does that change how I move through the world now? And how's that working out for me? You have to go that deep and you have to go that far back in order to start to correct some of these narratives and decide for yourself what it means to be a man.